First contact gone wrong. Lieutenant Sarah Chen stood at the viewport of the diplomatic vessel Concordia, watching the approaching Varaxian battle cruiser with a mixture of anticipation and concern. The massive ship's crystalline hull reflected the distant starlight, its angular design a testament to the warrior culture that built it. After 6 months of cautious long-range communications, this would be humanity's first face-to-face contact with the Varaxians. They're requesting permission to dock, Lieutenant. Communications Officer Torres reported from his station. Their honor guard wants to inspect our ship before their diplomatic team boards. Sarah nodded, having expected this. The Varaxians' obsession with martial prowess extended to every aspect of their society, including diplomacy. Grant permission, but remind them of our agreed-upon protocols. The docking procedure took nearly an hour, the Varaxians performing elaborate maneuvers that seemed more ceremonial than practical. When the airlock finally cycled, Sarah straightened her dress uniform and prepared to meet their guests. The first Varaxian to step through towered over her by at least 2 feet. Its iridescent scales shifted from deep purple to midnight blue as it moved. 4 arms crossed over its armored chest in what their briefings had identified as a gesture of challenge. Behind it, 4 more warriors took up defensive positions, their compound eyes scanning every corner of the reception area. "I am War Master Kextal," the leader announced, its translator rendering its clicks and whistles into crisp English. "You are the human commander." Sarah maintained perfect parade rest posture, neither aggressive nor submissive. "Lieutenant Sarah Chen, diplomatic liaison for the United Earth Federation. Welcome aboard the Concordia." Kextal's head tilted, all 4 arms uncrossing to gesture at her slight frame. "We were told we would meet with a warrior of rank. You appear insufficient." The insult was calculated, designed to provoke a response. Sarah had studied their psychology extensively. The Varaxians respected only those who could prove their strength, but humanity had learned long ago that true strength took many forms. "War Master, I assure you that I am more than sufficient for our purposes here," Sarah replied calmly. "Would you like to proceed to the conference room? We have prepared refreshments in accordance with your biological requirements." A low hum emanated from the Varaxian guards, their equivalent of derisive laughter. Kextal's scales flickered to a deep red. "You offer food when honor demands combat." Perhaps the reports of human weakness were correct. Sarah maintained her diplomatic smile. "We believe that sharing a meal can be as revealing as sharing combat. But if you prefer a different form of introduction, we can accommodate that as well." The War Master's compound eyes narrowed. "You speak of accommodation while your ships gather at our borders. Your kind sends vessels to chart our territory, to probe our defenses." "Scientific vessels," Sarah interrupted, knowing it was a breach of their protocol, but needing to redirect the conversation. "Unarmed research ships studying the unique stellar phenomena in the neutral zone. We have shared all their data with your scientific caste." "The warrior caste does not trust data," Kextal declared. "We trust what we can test with combat. Your species' reluctance to engage in honorable battle speaks to your fundamental weakness." Sarah felt the situation slipping away from her. The Varaxians had come expecting either submission or aggression. Her measured diplomatic approach was outside their conceptual framework. She needed to speak in terms they would understand. "War Master," she said, letting an edge enter her voice, "you mistake patience for weakness. Humans have fought countless wars among ourselves and against others. We choose peace not because we fear combat, but because we have mastered it so completely that we understand when it is unnecessary." This caught Kextal's attention. The other guards shifted their stance slightly, their scales rippling with interest. Bold words from one so small. Perhaps you would care to demonstrate this mastery. It was the opening Sarah had been waiting for, though it came sooner than expected. "I would be honored. However, as we are here to establish diplomatic relations, might I suggest a compromise? A demonstration rather than actual combat, one that would allow both our species to showcase their particular strengths." Kextal's scales shifted to a curious amber. "Explain." Your warriors pride themselves on their combat forms, yes, the precision of their movements, the perfection of their techniques. Sarah gestured to the open space of the reception area, perhaps a demonstration of these forms, followed by a human demonstration of our own methods. No blood need be shed for us to learn about each other's capabilities. The War Master was silent for a long moment, its compound eyes fixed on Sarah. Finally, it spoke. You seek to avoid true combat. I seek to avoid unnecessary violence while still honoring your traditions, Sarah corrected, unless you fear that your forms are not impressive enough without the drawing of blood. It was a calculated risk, using their own pride against them. But Sarah had studied their psychological profiles extensively. The Varaxians couldn't resist a challenge to their martial prowess, even one as subtle as this. Kextel's scales rippled with a complex pattern of colors. Very well, human. We will demonstrate the forms of the third circle of combat. Then we will observe your methods, but know that if we find them wanting, we will demand true combat. Sarah bowed slightly, careful to maintain the exact angle that their protocol described as respectful but not submissive. I understand, War Master. Please, show us your forms. As the Varaxians began their elaborate combat dance, Sarah watched intently. Every movement, every stance told her something about their psychology, their capabilities, and most importantly, their limitations. The coming demonstration would need to be perfect, not just a display of human martial skill, but a careful psychological operation that would challenge everything the Varaxians thought they knew about humanity. The future of human-Varaxian relations might well depend on what happened in the next hour, but Sarah had learned long ago that the most important battles were often won without throwing a single punch. The challenge. The Varaxian combat forms were beautiful in their lethal precision. 4 arms moved in perfect synchronization, each motion flowing into the next like liquid metal. Sarah watched as War Master Kextel led his honor guard through increasingly complex patterns, their scaled bodies shifting colors with each stance change. The display was clearly meant to intimidate, a reminder of how easily those same movements could end a human life. But Sarah saw something else in their dance of death. Every motion was prescribed, every step predetermined. The Varaxians had perfected these forms over centuries, but in doing so, they'd made them predictable. When the demonstration ended, Kextel turned to her with scales glowing in pride. Now you understand the superiority of Varaxian combat techniques. What could your species possibly show us to compare? Sarah stepped forward into the cleared space. Before I demonstrate, War Master, I have a question. In these forms, how do you account for an opponent who doesn't follow the traditional patterns? The question seemed to confuse Kextel. Any warrior worth facing knows the proper forms. To deviate would be dishonorable. I see. Sarah removed her dress uniform jacket, leaving her in a simple black undershirt. And if I told you that humans have developed thousands of different combat styles, each with its own forms and patterns? Impossible, one of the guards declared. Combat has been perfected through the third circle forms. There can be no other valid approaches. Sarah smiled slightly. Then let me show you something different. Officer Torres, if you would assist me. Torres stepped forward, and Sarah could see the Varaxian's dismissive reaction to his stocky, unimposing frame. Good, let them underestimate. This will be a demonstration of several human martial arts, Sarah announced. Torres, and I will show you how humans have adapted combat techniques from multiple sources to create something new. What followed was carefully choreographed, but made to look spontaneous. Sarah and Torres moved through sequences that borrowed from Aikido, Wing Chun, Capoeira, and other styles. Where the Varaxian forms had been rigid and power-focused, their movements emphasized flexibility, redirection, and the use of an opponent's strength against them. The Varaxians watched in growing agitation as Sarah repeatedly turned Torres' attacks aside with minimal effort, using his momentum to unbalance him in ways that defied their combat logic. When she finally ended the demonstration by flowing around a punch to tap Torres' throat with 2 fingers, A killing blow if executed for real. The reception area was dead silent. This, Kextal's scales had turned an uncertain gray. This is not proper combat. There are no set forms, no honorable exchanges. No, Sarah agreed, because in real combat, honor means survival. Survival means adaptation, and humans are very, very good at adapting. The War Master's inner eyelids flickered rapidly. You mock our traditions. Not at all. I respect them. But I also want you to understand that humanity's strength lies in our ability to learn, to change, to incorporate new ideas. Sarah gestured to the space between them. Your forms are beautiful and deadly, but they're also predictable to anyone who studies them long enough. You claim you could defeat a Varaxian warrior. Kextal's scales flushed deep red. I claim that victory and defeat aren't always what they seem. Sarah met the War Master's compound eyes steadily, which is why I propose a challenge. The word sent a ripple of color changes through all the Varaxians. Challenge was of the core of their culture, their religion, their very way of life. Sarah knew she was playing with fire, but it was calculated risk. Speak your challenge, human, Kextal demanded. 1 week from now, your champion against me, in your arena on your ship. If I win, the Varaxian hierarchy agrees to full diplomatic relations with humanity, including mutual defense treaties. And when you lose? Sarah smiled. Then humanity acknowledges the superiority of Varaxian combat techniques and agrees to withdraw all research vessels from the neutral zone. The stakes were enormous, and she could practically hear the objections that would come from Earth Command when they learned of this. But she had seen enough in the past hour to know this was their best path forward. You would stake so much on single combat? Kextal asked. I stake it on understanding. Sarah corrected. Both of our species value strength. War Master, we just define it differently. This challenge will let us demonstrate those differences and perhaps learn from each other. The Varaxians conducted a rapid discussion in their own language, their scales flickering through patterns too quick for Sarah to follow. Finally, Kextal turned back to her. We accept your challenge, Lieutenant Sarah Chen. In 7 cycles, you will face our champion in the Hall of Sacred Combat aboard the Crystalline Verdict. Its scales shifted to deep purple. I look forward to teaching humanity its proper place in the galaxy. After the Varaxians had departed, Torres approached Sarah. Permission to speak freely, sir. Granted. Are you insane? They're warriors trained from birth. They have 4 arms and natural armor. How are you planning to win? Sarah watched the Varaxian ship through the viewport, its crystalline hull now dark and threatening. By showing them that sometimes the strongest position is choosing not to strike at all. She turned to her communications officer. Get me a secure line to Earth Command. And then I need everything we have on Varaxian combat philosophy. Every recorded match, every mention in their historical documents. You have a plan. Better, Sarah replied. I have an understanding of their weakness. They're so convinced of their combat superiority that they've stopped learning, stopped adapting. And that's something humanity has never done. Understanding the enemy. The holographic display filled Sarah's quarters with images of Varaxian combat matches. She'd been studying them for days now, barely sleeping, searching for patterns within patterns. The same forms she'd witnessed on the Concordia played out again and again, each match a variation on unchanging themes. Computer, replay match sequence 47. She commanded, standing in the center of her room. As the holographic Varaxians began their deadly dance, she moved with them, mimicking their forms but with human limitations. 2 arms instead of 4, no natural armor, different center of gravity. Each limitation was an opportunity. A chime at her door interrupted her study. Enter. Admiral Yao stepped into the room, his weathered face creased with concern. Lieutenant Chen, I've reviewed your report on the diplomatic contact. You've put us in quite a situation. Sarah straightened to attention. Sir, I understand the risk. Do you? He gestured at the frozen hologram. The Joint Chiefs are furious. You've staked our entire diplomatic initiative on single combat with a species that's literally evolved for warfare. Some are calling for you to be relieved of duty. But you haven't relieved me, Sarah observed. The Admiral's stern expression softened slightly. No, because a few of us think we see what you're planning. But I need to hear it from you. Convince me this isn't suicide. Sarah gestured to the holographic display. Computer, show comparative analysis of last 1,000 recorded Varaxian matches. The air filled with scrolling data. Look at the patterns, sir. Every match, every movement follows the same fundamental forms. They haven't evolved their combat style in centuries. Because it works, Yao countered. Their techniques are incredibly effective against opponents who play by their rules. Sarah walked through the holographic data, pointing to specific matches. But look what happens on the rare occasions when someone breaks pattern. The Varaxians actually perform worse than their baseline. They don't adapt well to unexpected situations. The Admiral studied the data. And you think you can use this? I know I can. But I need access to something specific. She pulled up another file. The Monastery of the Five Winds. Yao's eyebrows rose. The Buddhist monastery. What does that have to do with Varaxian combat? Everything. Sarah's eyes lit up with conviction. Sir, the Varaxians believe that combat prowess equals strength. But they've never encountered someone who can demonstrate strength through deliberate nonviolence. Understanding began to dawn on the Admiral's face. You're not planning to fight them at all, are you? Oh, I'll fight. Just not in any way they'll expect. She gestured at the combat recordings. The Varaxians have made their fighting style into a religion. I plan to show them a different kind of faith. Yao was quiet for a long moment, studying her. Finally, he nodded. I'll approve the monastery visit. But Chen, if this goes wrong, it's not just your life at stake. The political fallout could push us into war. It won't go wrong, sir, because I'm not going to defeat their champion. I'm going to make him defeat himself. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah spent hours with the monks at the Five Winds Monastery, not learning to fight, but learning to be absolutely present in every moment. The techniques they taught her were ancient, passed down through centuries of spiritual practice. In between sessions, she continued studying Varaxian culture, their evolution as a species, their religious beliefs, their concept of honor, everything connected back to physical combat. They valued strength above all else because their harsh home world had demanded it, but they had never questioned what strength truly meant. The night before she was due to return to the Concordia, the head monk found her practicing breathing exercises in the monastery garden. You've learned quickly, he observed, settling beside her on the stone bench. I had to. Tomorrow I face their champion. The old monk smiled. No, tomorrow you face yourself. That is always the true challenge. Sarah thought about the coming fight, about everything at stake. Master, their entire culture is built around combat. How can I show them another way without seeming to disrespect their beliefs? Ah, the monk's eyes twinkled. Now you ask the right question. Tell me, when the wind blows against the mountain, which is stronger? The mountain, of course. Are you sure? The mountain stands rigid and unchanging. But the wind adapts. It flows around, over, through. It reshapes the mountain one grain at a time. He placed a gnarled hand on her shoulder. Sometimes the greatest strength lies in yielding. Sarah pondered this as she watched the monastery's prayer flags flutter in the breeze. Each movement was both surrender and persistence, yielding and enduring at the same time. Like the forms she'd been practicing. Forms that appeared submissive but contained their own kind of power. I think I understand, she said finally. The monk nodded. Good. Remember, Lieutenant, true victory often looks nothing like what we expect. The Varaxians believe strength flows from combat. Show them that sometimes strength flows from its absence. Back in her quarters on the Concordia, Sarah spent her final night reviewing everything one last time. The Varaxian combat forms, the monastery's teachings, the cultural briefings, all of it would come together tomorrow. But success wouldn't depend on physical prowess or fighting skill. It would depend on her ability to demonstrate a kind of strength the Varaxians had never conceived of, a strength that came not from the ability to strike, but from the wisdom to know when not to strike at all. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah smiled. Tomorrow would change everything, not through violence, but through its transcendence. The Varaxians were about to learn that humanity's greatest strength had never been in its fists. The arena of truth, the hall of sacred combat aboard the crystalline verdict, was a vast dodecahedral chamber, its crystalline walls refracting light in complex patterns. Hundreds of Varaxians filled the tiered observation rings, their scales creating a rippling aurora of colors as they shifted and murmured. In the center, a perfectly circular arena was inscribed with ancient combat runes. Sarah stood at one entrance, dressed in simple black meditation robes rather than a combat suit. The choice had caused quite a stir among both human and Varaxian observers. She could hear the whispers, see the flickering of scales that indicated disapproval or confusion. "You still have time to withdraw," Admiral Yao said quietly beside her. "No one would blame you. That's exactly why I can't." Sarah took a deep breath, centering herself as the monks had taught her. Everything depends on seeing this through. A resonant tone filled the chamber, and War Master Kextol's voice boomed out in both languages. "Witnesses to sacred combat, we gather to resolve the challenge between our peoples. Representing the Varaxian hierarchy, War Champion Zexkar." From the opposite entrance strode a Varaxian nearly twice Sarah's size. Unlike the others, whose scales showed various colors, Zexkar's were pure obsidian black, a rare genetic trait that marked him as combat-blessed by their gods. All four of his arms rippled with muscle, and his movements spoke of absolute lethal grace. Representing the Human Federation, Lieutenant Sarah Chen. Sarah walked calmly to the center of the arena, her bare feet silent on the polished floor. She could sense the Varaxians' collective dismissal. Even Zexkar's scales flickered with what she recognized as contempt. "The terms are set," Kextol continued. "Victory will be declared upon submission or incapacitation. Death is not required, but is accepted as a possible outcome. Does any party wish to amend these terms?" "I do." Sarah's voice carried clearly through the chamber. The crowd's murmuring ceased instantly. Zexkar's scales rippled. "The human wishes to surrender before we begin." "No." Sarah turned to address the gathered audience directly. "I wish to add a condition for victory. If I can remain in this arena for 1 full hour without being defeated, while demonstrating true strength, I win." The chamber erupted in that humming sound she now recognized as Varaxian laughter. Even Kextol's scales showed amusement. "You believe you can evade our war champion for an hour, even for a human. This is profound arrogance." "Not evasion," Sarah corrected. "Presence. True combat. True strength. But on my terms." Zexkar stepped forward, looming over her. "I accept these terms. It will make my victory even more complete when I defeat you before your hour is done." "Let it be witnessed," Kextol declared. "Sacred combat begins at the tone." Sarah settled into a cross-legged sitting position in the center of the arena. "What are you doing?" Zexkar demanded. "Stand and face me with honor." "I am facing you," Sarah replied calmly. "With complete presence and attention. That is its own kind of honor." The tone sounded. Zexkar circled her slowly, scales shifting between rage red and confusion gray. "Stand and fight." "No." Sarah's voice remained perfectly steady. "I choose not to meet violence with violence, but I am here, fully present, fully engaged in this combat. Strike if you wish." The war champion snarled and launched a lightning-fast attack, all 4 arms striking at different angles. Sarah flowed like water, redirecting force with minimal movement, never leaving her seated position. Each blow that should have landed somehow didn't, yet she never blocked or parried in any traditional sense. Fight back. Zexkar roared, his attacks becoming faster, more furious. But fury made his movements predictable, locked into the forms he'd trained in since birth. Sarah remained centered, peaceful, letting his attacks flow around her like the wind around a mountain. 10 minutes passed. 20. Zexkar's strikes began to lose precision as frustration overtook his training. Sarah had not thrown a single punch, had not even stood up, yet she remained untouched. "What trickery is this?" he demanded, scales now cycling through colors rapidly, a sign of emotional distress. "No trickery," Sarah replied. "Only a different kind of strength, one that doesn't require violence to prove itself." 30 minutes. The chamber was dead silent except for Zexkar's increasingly ragged breathing. His attacks had become almost desperate, yet still Sarah sat, unmoved except to redirect his force away from her with subtle shifts and turns. "Stand and fight me," he bellowed. "Where is your warrior's pride?" "My pride is in knowing that true strength sometimes means choosing not to fight," Sarah answered. "Every attack you launch teaches me more about your forms. Every strike shows me the beauty of your traditions. I honor them by demonstrating a different path." 40 minutes. Zexkar stood trembling, all four arms limp at his sides. His scales had faded to a dull gray, the color of complete confusion. Around the arena, other Varaxians were showing similar colors. Everything they knew about combat, about strength, about honor was being challenged by this small human who refused to fight yet could not be defeated. "I do not understand," Zexkar said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "What are you?" "I am simply human," Sarah replied. "We learned long ago that there are many kinds of strength. The strength to fight, yes, but also the strength to choose peace, the strength to remain still in the face of violence, the strength to see beyond ancient forms to new possibilities. Wisdom through peace." 50 minutes had passed. Zexkar, the undefeated war champion of the Varaxians, stood motionless in the arena, his obsidian scales now showing flecks of white, a color Sarah had never seen in their species before. Around them, the chamber remained silent, hundreds of compound eyes fixed on the scene below. "In all my cycles of combat," Zexkar spoke finally, "no opponent has ever made me feel so powerless." "Not powerless," Sarah corrected gently. "Power flows through you like a river. But like a river, it needs direction, purpose. When you fight only to prove strength, you lose sight of why strength matters." The war champion's inner eyelids flickered rapidly. "You could have fought back, could have attempted to defeat me. And what would that have proven? That humans can fight. That violence answers violence." Sarah's voice carried to every corner of the chamber. "We chose a different path, to show strength through peace, wisdom through stillness." 55 minutes. The tension in the chamber was palpable. Sarah remained seated, centered, at peace. Zexkar stood before her, all four arms loose at his sides, scales continuing to show that mysterious white coloration. Then, to the shock of everyone present, the mighty war champion slowly lowered himself to sit cross-legged across from Sarah. "Teach me," he said simply. The word sent a ripple through the audience. A war champion, asking to learn from an opponent. It was unprecedented. Sarah saw War Master Kextel's scales cycling through a dozen colors as he tried to process this development. "The hour is not yet complete," Sarah responded. "You still have time to win by traditional means." Zexkar's scales shifted to a deep blue, the color of certainty. "You have already won, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, not through force or combat, but by showing us a strength we had forgotten could exist." The final minutes ticked by in profound silence. When the tone sounded marking the hour's completion, neither combatant moved. They simply sat, teacher and student, warrior and diplomat, two species finding understanding in stillness. War Master Kextel's voice, when it came, was subdued. "The challenge is complete. The human has demonstrated true strength. The terms of victory are met. As the formal words of the combat resolution were spoken, Sarah finally rose to her feet. She extended a hand to Zexkar, who took it with surprising gentleness as he stood. "Your people," the war champion said, "they all possess this different strength." Sarah smiled. "We all have the potential for it. Just as your people have the potential to grow beyond the limits of tradition. Perhaps we can learn from each other." "Yes," Zexkar agreed, his scales now showing swirls of blue and gold, colors of certainty and revelation. "The forms teach us precision, discipline, but you have shown us that true strength lies in knowing when to use them and when to transcend them." In the days that followed, as the diplomatic treaties were drawn up and signed, Sarah found herself spending more time in the Hall of Sacred Combat. Not fighting, but teaching and learning. Varaxian warriors sat with her, learning meditation and mindfulness, while she studied their forms and philosophies. Word spread quickly through both cultures. The human who had won without fighting. The war champion who learned to sit in peace. Some called it a revolution in Varaxian society. Sarah preferred to think of it as an evolution, a natural progression from strength of arms to strength of spirit. 1 month after the challenge, Sarah stood with Admiral Yao on the observation deck of the Concordia, watching Varaxian and human ships conducting joint exercises. "The Joint Chiefs are calling it a miracle," Yao said. "2 months ago, we were on the brink of war. Now we're trading cultural attaches and planning joint colonies." Sarah watched a group of Varaxian warriors practicing meditation with human instructors on one of the lower decks. "Not a miracle, sir. Just a reminder that true strength often looks different than we expect. Sometimes the hardest thing is to stay still, to remain present, to choose peace when everything in us cries out for action." And the Varaxians? Will this change last? "Look at their ships." Sarah gestured to where a Varaxian cruiser was executing a new type of maneuver, one that borrowed from human tactics. "They're already adapting, growing, learning to be both strong and flexible, just as we're learning from their discipline and tradition." The Admiral nodded thoughtfully. "The wind and the mountain." "Sir, something I read in your report about the monastery. The wind reshapes the mountain 1 grain at a time." He smiled. "Well done, Lieutenant. Very well done indeed." Sarah watched as another group of Varaxians arrived for their meditation session, led by none other than war champion Zexkar himself. His scales now permanently showed streaks of that mysterious white color, a visible sign of the change that had begun in that hour of combat. Perhaps that was humanity's greatest strength after all, not our ability to fight, but our ability to show others that there were alternatives to fighting. To demonstrate that true power often lay not in the force of our strikes, but in our capacity to remain still and present in the face of violence. To prove that sometimes the greatest victory came not from defeating an enemy, but from turning that enemy into a student, a teacher, and ultimately, a friend. The stars stretched out before them, infinite in their possibilities, and in their light, 2 species had begun to learn a new definition of strength, together.